This entire main plaza that we're looking at would have been covered with white plaster. So imagine with the sun beating off of it, how blinding it would be. So the goal was really to, I think, to overwhelm visitors to the site. I think if you were somebody who didn't come up here very often, you would just be, all your senses would be engaged by the site. And that, I think, was the goal. So we know that there's white plaster on the main plaza and on the buildings, and we know that they also use a red paint for trim. So they definitely were thinking about the aesthetics, the visual experience of the architecture. We are in the one part of the site where we actually do have a Period 1 building exposed. But even here, this gives you a really good example of how the architecture was done. So inside that tunnel we're going to go in, you're going to see an actual Period 1 building. However, what you can see, there are various layers on top of it. So the reason why these stones are preserved in situ here is because they built another platform on top of it, and then yet other platforms on top of that. So if you look sort of at this profile here, you can actually see all those stones that they just use as fill, and then they just made a facade of flat stones on top of that. So this is pretty typical of the architecture here. You know, sort of river cobbles or other things tossed in as fill, and then a facade of flat stones. Those are the only stones that are generally worked, the ones that you would actually have on the exterior. So this is this so-called famous Gallery of the Danzantes, and these Danzantes would have actually been in this wall you're going to see. So what you have, these ones here are all casts. The originals are either here at the visitor center or they're in Mexico City. However, the reason why we know how these stones were organized is there's still several rows of them inside that tunnel. There's been a lot of debate about what they mean. It used to be thought they were dancers, which is why they're called the danzantes. They were doing some kind of a, pre-Hispanic lambada or something up here. But now people have, then there was in the 60s, people observed that most of these actually are naked and they have closed eyes. And a lot of them seem to have mutilation of their genitals. And they're probably all male. So then the thought was, well, maybe they're sacrificed prisoners. And that's been the prevailing concept for many years. But again, this Javier Cid has looked at them again, and he actually thinks that, you know what, these are probably important people or ancestors in the founding of Monte Alban. There's a whole facade of these, and you can see why they're preserved is because they built another platform over it without removing the stone. So that's what these walls are right here. So this is representing a rebuilding episode, an enlargement of this platform. So that's why these are preserved. So what you got is actually two types of stones. You have the so-called danzantes, the large vertical ones, and again, the bottom row, they all face north, second row all face south, and there's part of the third row intact, they also face north. So that's why it's been possible to provide a reconstruction of how these all looked, that they were all incorporated into one facade. And this Javier Cid says, it's almost like a codex, that you read codices, what they call Bustrofitian style, where you go one direction, turn around, and go the next direction. So he really thinks that that kind of syntax was in play here. You also notice that the first kind of stone, the danzantes, have glyphs on them. So again, what makes Monte Alban so unique is at 500 BC, not only do we have a very well-developed artistic program, we also have writing. So everything we see at the site, all the public architecture, is very much on this north-south axis that the whole site, the public part of the site, is organized. This one's different. So this one, you can see it comes to a point, and it points southwest. As you can imagine, archaeoastronomers have had a field day with this, trying to find different celestial phenomenon that this may be referencing. And the jury's sort of still out. But what I'll point out is there are actually little tunnels and other things that connect some of these buildings with each other. So some people think that we simply also have sort of a certain directionality here, that there's a focus on channeling power, channeling people through this building. What makes this building problematic is it's sort of unique. There's only one other building somewhat like it, and it's at a site near Yagul called Caballito Blanco. But that building, it was in horrible shape, so it's not clear if it's actually arrow-shaped like this one. And if it is arrow-shaped, it points to a different orientation. So it's not the same southwest orientation. So no one really has a super compelling reason why this points southwest. But what this is, so this is Building J, and it's a platform. So on top of that is a temple. So what we're looking at is really, one of the few period 2 structures that's exposed. So the south platform is something that primarily is developed in the Classic and Late Classic. Now, my first experience doing archaeology in Oaxaca was actually volunteering on this part of the site because they actually were trying to consolidate this. As you can see, it did not turn out too well. The problem is, like every other structure here, this was rebuilt and rebuilt, and what happened is they had, the staircase had like 2 or 3 different building episodes exposed. So this is how, in the Classic period, they look, but you can see the space on the western side of the main plaza compared to the eastern, it's wider, it's not symmetric. And this, I think, was something that concerned the Zapotecs. So what they did, they created this architectural innovation in the Late Classic that we call Temple, Patio, Altar, or TPA. And so if we look at this building here, which I think is Building L, we've got the original building with its double-A scapulario from the Classic period, and you can even see on top of the platform, there's a 2-room temple, right? So what they did is they added this, a wall around it, and then this, basically this huge stone embankment. So we have essentially the temple still over there, but what they've done, they've created a patio, right? And then in the center of that, you can see just a little bit of it there, there's an altar. There's a stone, a rectangular stone structure, very destroyed but visible. So this becomes a very distinct Zapotec Late Classic architectural innovation, the TPA. So in period 3, this is really when Montalban is getting to be at its peak, and we see a totally different artistic program again. So again, this is our 3rd artistic program. What we see in the sculptural program, first of all, there are fewer sculptures, but the ones we have are really large, and they all have a similar theme. So what we see are a series of individuals, and look what they're on. They're on a place cliff. That's somebody standing on a place cliff. So almost all these individuals standing on place cliffs got the same thing going on. They're dressed as animals, and they're in chains. Their arms are actually bound, behind them. His arms are bound behind him. He's got like this long ribbon that we also often see captives wearing. So what this is actually a presentation of captives, and they're being presented to this guy right here. What we're looking at is probably the most sacred spot at Montalban. That's called Building H, where those guys are rustling in front of it. Nice. So we have a massive stairway, and then as you get up, you can see nice examples of double-A scapulario architecture. And then on top of that is the largest of the temples at Montalban. Again, it's a 2-room temple, and this one you can really see well. You can see the back room, right? And then in the front room, you can still see there the base of circular columns. So obviously we're at Montalban Ball Court. There are 2 at Montalban. Very interesting, there's going to be 3 at Itzompa, which is sort of like a Montalban suburb. So we only have 2 here. This is the biggest one. And notice how it's just in the northeast corner of the main plaza. So this is very much incorporated into the public core of the site. The other one is actually some distance away. So this is the only one in the public core of the site. So you can see the extensive reconstruction. This building and Building J are probably the 2 most, I might say, overly reconstructed buildings. So you have to be very careful in what we see here and what we think is actual original architecture. But I think what we do have for sure, we have our typical capital I-shaped ball court with our long axis, and then these sloping surfaces would have been covered with plaster and would have been smooth. So we think that part of the playing of the ball game would involve hitting it off of those sides. And we think that on top of each of them would have been some kind of a reviewing stand or a gallery where people could actually observe the ball game. One of the things you notice right away is one thing you could do is go down into that sunken patio there. And again, that sunken patio is a little bit like what we were talking about on the south platform, where you have a series of mounds arranged around inner space. So the north platform is really all about control of space. So the only way to get back, in fact, where those people are, that's actually the original path back there. There's sort of an architecture basically channeling you all into that one little gate. So you can imagine how easy it would have been to control where people went up here. So the north platform is where the elite lived. If you're from the DC area, I always think of the north platform as DuPont Circle. It's sort of where the wealthy, the elite lived. So it's DuPont Circle. And what we have is a series of administrative buildings. We, of course, have our mounds here with temples on top. And then in the northern part, we have palaces. So what we're going to be able to see as we get to the northern part of this, we're actually going to be able to see where some of these really famous tombs were located. They actually found an example of period 4 art in more or less its original context. And I actually happen to be here visiting, and so this stela that you see there, of course that's a cast, the original's in the museum on site. That was found just sloped down a bit. I think it's got carvings on both sides, and the other side was the one that was on the exposed. So that had fallen and was downslope. So I really think that that's more or less probably where it was placed, somewhere on that slope. This is, of course, the site of Itzompa, and it's very different from Monte Alban in the sense you don't have that sense of massive modification of the landscape. Instead, they used 4 basic terraces to put their architecture on. So there is no main plaza here, all right? What this is, it's really a celebration of elite culture. Almost everything you see here are elite structures combined with administrative functions as well as some public functions. So this is basically like what we saw on the north platform times 10. So this is bigger structures, more complex structures than on the North Acropolis at Monte Alban. This site then, it's almost nothing here before what I've been calling period 3. And everything you're going to see today is period 4. So this represents Monte Alban at its biggest and baddest, right? The total expansion of Monte Alban covering all these hills. So here we have, right there you've got El Gallo, and there's Monte Alban. So anyways, this is Ball Court 1, and this is the one that is larger, again, 44 meters long, so much larger than the other ones, and actually larger than anything at Monte Alban. This is a lot, though, like the one at Monte Alban in its placement. So it's just off, really to the east of the highest part of the site, just like the main ball court was at Monte Alban, and it has some niches you saw. So some people think those niches in the corner are actually where maybe an image, maybe a ceramic urn, grave-ware urn was placed, and perhaps the breaking of that urn or the protection of that urn was a really important part of the game. One of the really interesting parts about the excavation of the House of the Altars, the Palace of the Altars, in addition to these really sort of complex rooms, is they actually found a ceramic kiln. And we can go around what they've done. So the kiln itself that they excavated was very deep here. So what they did is they reconstructed a version of it on top of it. So what you're seeing here is not the original kiln, but is a reconstructed version of the kiln placed directly on top of the original. So this gives you a really good sense of what these look like, because fragments of them have been found like this in Monte Alban, going back as far as the first, what I call period 1. And if you look in, you can see you've got sort of like a lattice-like network of stones that provides a basic support. The vessels were placed on top of that chamber, and then you can see here the chamber where they control the fire from below that. So these are some of the kinds of huge vessels that came from here, and we'll see original massive vessels that they think were fired perhaps in this very kiln in the museum. So Dian Su, although it looks like a pretty small site, actually becomes part of a mega site that's part of a site called Makbil Sochidol, which is still occupied. There's still people there, right over there. And in fact, that hill right there, if you can see it with a little sort of mound on top, that's called Cerro Danush. And that has a very important, what I've been calling period 4 site on it. And that actually is currently being, or has been excavated in the last year or so. They're actually excavating the entire terrace of that. So what you get a sense of, Dian Su starts as a very self-contained site, and then through time becomes with this much larger entity, Makbil Sochidol. So we see this structure really drawing power from where it is, and look at the scale of this structure. This is not a structure you would find at any other site unless it's an administrative complex for the Monte Alban state. So the people who lived here were definitely part of that apparatus, and that's why we actually find not just public architecture, we find elite structures. What you see here is actually a pretty large collection of bas-relief sculptures. And these are often called the ball player sculptures. However, you see right away that they're not all ball players. You actually have several figures who are seated, right, with big headdresses doing other things. So what does that tell you? That we have figures like this who are seated, and then here we have some really good examples of our ball players. What should be the first thing that comes to your mind when I tell you that there are actually several different types of sculptures in this way?
They've been moved.
Reused. Awesome, thank you. So these sculptures are not in their original location. All right. So when Bernal excavated here, a lot of these stones are where he found them, but they were clearly part of a different program, and they were put here by the ancient Dian Su inhabitants. It's a very different theme. Right? We see, if you can see, we see a standing figure, right? There his legs are. He has probably his name glyph. There's a cartouche, and there's the bar for 5, a really elaborate headdress, and look what he's wearing. He's got a mask on. So this is almost surely part of this narrative that involves the ball players. They left the northern side totally unexcavated and unreconstructed, and then a few years ago this happened. I don't know if they were trying to reconstruct it and couldn't really find good architecture, but so now it's like this sort of unpleasant jumble of stones, but it used to be just this nice green mound, and you really got a sense of how one of these ball courts looked before archaeologists got to it. But the other side I think gives you a really good idea of what one of these classic Oaxacan ball courts would look like. So we talked a little bit at Monte Alban how these little tiny steps have been covered, so they've been flat with plaster. And then on top is a little reviewing stand. So you get a sense where people would have actually been watching the ball court from. Yep. All right, so at Lambacheco, this is a huge site. However, they've only excavated 2 mounds, right? And this is mound 195. So we're going to look at these 2 mounds very quickly, and we'll also take a look at that patio complex out there. So the 2 mounds date from the late Classic. So this is a really important period 4 site. So you really do get the sense that what's being portrayed in that stucco frieze, they really were taking the long bones of their ancestors. And this is part of this process you have of people here sort of doing their own thing, right? This is probably a group who founded the site as an offshoot of Monte Alban, and started their own sort of architectural and aesthetic programs. In period 4, the Zapotecs are really experimenting with stucco. We don't see a lot of stucco work at Monte Alban, but you saw stucco work in Mound 195, and look at this, these fantastic Cosijo stucco sculptures. Just fabulous, and that's pretty much how they were found. And you can see, look at what they're on top of too. That's like that the doble scapulario we saw at Monte Alban. So you can still see them sort of referencing classic period Zapotec architecture. And we already start seeing little step and fret motifs inside of the doble scapulario, and that's done with stucco. All right, so we're in the first of the 2 groups we're going to explore in post-classic Mitla. So these groups have a very standardized format. They're basically 3 patios. So this is perhaps a very standard one. When we get to the group of the columns, you're going to see a little bit different how those patios are arranged. So we're in the central patio. The southern patio has been completely sort of obliterated by that church. And again, you saw the church sitting right on top of the pre-Hispanic architecture as we came in. So I think one question to ask, why is Mitla so important? This was not a place in the valley that was super productive for agriculture, but is a place that for a long time has been about trade and exchange. In period 5, this very important mercantile association continues, but also it seems Mitla becomes a really important religious spot. So the term, it's in Zapotec it's Leoba, in Nahuatl it's Mictlan, it essentially means place of the dead, place of the souls. So this was a very important spiritual place. So all 4 of the lintels over these entrances had these codex-style scenes. So this is the so-called Mixteca Pueblo style, and they actually see some very elaborate scenes of people coming in temples and elite buildings. This is the best preserved one. The lintel over the doorways is recessed. Can you see that? It's recessed in every single place. So one of my colleagues thinks even if they're not painted like this, that recessed area would have been perfect for displaying a codex. You could actually unfold a codex, and they fit perfectly in those spaces. So this is just a really nice view of all these mosaic designs. You have Greca, step and fret, you name it. And they're all a little bit different. So these have generally not been reconstructed. They had fallen in chunks, and they're put back together again. So this is not like some invention of the archaeologists. This is actually called the room of the priest or the leader. And this isn't just sort of total fantasy or speculation. The Spanish colonial sources tell about the person who lived here with his family was one of the most sacred and venerated rulers in the Valley of Oaxaca. And so although Mitla isn't a very large site and its urban density is minimal, it had an outsized importance, not only because of its really important role in trade, but because we get the sense that this was a place that mediated disputes. And the priests at Mitla were very important. We know that, in fact, the tombs you're going to see probably was filled with some of these priests/leaders. So just take a look and admire the stonework here. This is where some of the best preservation is, where you can actually see some of the red pigment that was found. A lot of that is original. So what we know about these, Tomb 1 was already opened when Marshal Seville was here circa 1900. So Tomb 1 had basically been stripped of everything by the local folks in Mitla. So there's absolutely nothing he found in Tomb 1, except you'll see it has a huge column. Not surprising since this is still the group of the columns. So Tomb 1 has a huge column at the back. And the local legend was if you could put your arms around it, if you're female, you'd get pregnant soon after that. So Tomb 2 was not exposed, and Seville found it in 1901. So unfortunately, this tomb had been looted in colonial times. In our center we have our altar, and notice you can actually see the remains of step and fret designs, right? So throughout this site, we actually see a lot of the same kind of mosaic sculptures we just saw at Mitla, but on a smaller and more restricted scale. So this whole lower facade of this altar is decorated with those same kinds of step and fret designs we just saw at Mitlas. So what we know, Yagul is a very important classic and late classic site, and it maintains its importance throughout the post-classic. So this is one of those sites where we don't see any kind of a cessation in occupation. There is a frog or toad of some kind, but you've seen so far Zapotec art is very two-dimensional, mostly bas-relief in terms of stonework. So that's a very unusual piece. It really is a three-dimensional sculpture. You'll see the shallow basin behind it. This is the famous triple tomb, the Agul. So you're going to go in there, and you're actually going to see three separate tombs. So three separate tombs all accessed through the same stairway. And again, you're going to see some of these mosaic step and fret designs. And you're even going to see, people have been asking me at Mitla, what were those holes for, right? Those are for, I was saying, probably for tenon heads, for sculptures that would fit in there. You can see one in here. So this is the largest ball court in Oaxaca. By far, this is the largest ball court. The only one that comes close is ball court 1 at Oaxaca. Right? So this is much bigger than any other ball court we've seen. One problem you'll notice right away with this ball court, though, is here they have the chinking stones, and you can see, like on this side, almost the entire thing is reconstructed. You have to look around the end zone here to finally find a few rows of stones that don't have those chinking stones. So you do get a sense that basically the archaeologists found the overall shape of this, but so much of the details were reconstructed. The other thing I want to point out about this particular ball court is that ball court marker. And again, the thought with ball court markers is they probably were flush with the surface of the court. So I think actually where Michael is a pretty good place to try to work our way through the labyrinth, no? And this is, so there actually was yellow pigment here. Involved in the ruling of this place, and very much.
If it was white, it'd be easier to see.
How much light in there?
Really? Yeah, there's...
Very unimportant or small lake plastic. Basically, Xochitl is actually a very large site. All we're going to see today is, you can tell we're in a palace, and the palace actually has two tombs that can be entered right through this little patio. As you come down the steps, what are you seeing right here? What does this look like to you?
This is the geology.
Oh my gosh.
So we're actually having our step fret designs, right? We have panels, but look at this. They're carved and made of stucco here. It actually looks like the entrance to a palace, right? So what you're really seeing, we talk about this loosely, but this really is a house for the dead. You actually have the entrance, doesn't this look like the entrances we saw at Mila? It's even painted red. And we even have, look at this, the lintel is recessed. So you could almost think maybe there could be a little codex here.
Yeah.
And then you also get the sense that this is not a typical post-classic tomb because it's not cruciform. So you have one chamber, again, the antechamber is where all these possible sacrifices were, and then we've got some great stucco sculptures. So
Yeah, those are amazing.
all of these are stucco. So that guy is wearing a turtle carapace. He might be carrying either digging sticks or lightning bolts in his hands, and he's just sort of floating. And then there are two figures on either side of the wall. Striding figures, one looks like a death lord, See that giant skull? And the other ones are actually
Cubans, Asians,
labeled, and they're Lord 5 flower and 9 flower. And then also take a look, Ruth, to your left. It's an owl. It's a stucco owl. What does this remind you of, perhaps, that we've seen on this very trip? A main plaza. So what happened in period 2, almost to show that this is part of the Montalban state apparatus, is they totally transformed the site. So Mound 1, which was such the focus of public architecture, simply becomes the south platform of a main plaza. And in many ways, this main plaza is, I always call it mini Montalban. It's like little Montalban. It's a smaller version of the main plaza with architecture elements on the east and west, and then that road we went through, just beyond that, is this site's version of the north platform. So you actually have architecture bounding this on the east and west, and then a central axis of architecture as well. The problem is, as you can see, most of this has now been destroyed. You know, we have people living right on the main plaza. Imagine if people were living on the main plaza of Montalban. This is what it would look like.